Morning, everybody, and thanks ever so much for inviting us. I'm Paul Taylor, and I'm going to be guiding us through this morning's session. So just in terms of how it's going to be working, I'm going to do an introduction in terms of, Bromford's background, how it came up with the neighbourhood coaching model, where it's kind of got to so far. Then we're going to have a brief breakout session in which we're going to ask about what are the barriers to these ways of working and how we could potentially move on from those barriers. Then we're going to have, I'm delighted to say we've got two of our neighbourhood coaches who are going to join us, and they're going to tell us the kind of conversations we have with our communities and the impact that is having, and they're going to do a Q&A session with you as well. Then we're going to move on to more innovation, and then Katie's going to kind of join us to talk about Bromford Lab itself and how we generate ideas from our colleagues. And then I'm going to move on to talk a little bit more about strategic innovation and collaboration. So hopefully it's going to be a useful session for you. We're really keen to hear about your experiences. It's not about us talking all the time, but I am going to talk at you for about 15 minutes, just in terms of telling you a little bit more about the story so far. Please put questions in the chat box. We want this to be as open and honest as possible, so we're looking forward to lots of questions. So I'm Paul, I'm innovation coach at Bromford. We'll talk a little bit more about the innovation coach role later on, but I've been with Bromford, I've worked in housing for 23 years in a variety of roles, and particularly over the past 10 years been working in kind of research and development and innovation. And I was there at the start when we started putting together this move away from our traditional housing management role. So let me just go back then. So when I started in housing, we had a visit day once a week, okay? And then when we went out and spent time in the communities, the rest of the time, so 80% pretty much, was spent on kind of back office admin, essentially, okay? That's where we were. Where we got to is we wanted to flip that. And I'm going to talk you through the story of how we flipped that model and how we moved away, or hopefully have started moving away from reactive to preventative services. And I'll say as a kind of, as a health warning, I'm not saying we've completed that journey at all. It's something we work on every single day, and there's still loads of improvements we could make. So we're a housing association. I'm not going to talk too much about housing associations because we want to concentrate on the links between health and housing. But essentially, housing associations, there's about 1,500 of them in the UK. They are largely non-profit associations, meaning that any profits that do make goes back into the provision of more housing. Now, as you know, there's a housing crisis in the UK. There's a lot of people who are unable to access the conventional market because the conventional market is so dysfunctional and has been for some time. Additionally, and you can see the statistics there, we've lost a huge number of homes through what's known as social rent, which is sub-market rental for people on the very lowest incomes within the UK. And we've lost a lot of those. Now, you know more than I do that the impacts on people's health and well-being if they do not have secure accommodation, a place to call a home. So it's a pressure within the housing sector, but it also has additional pressures on your services and the services you're trying to provide. We provide sub-market rents, we provide market rent housing, we provide shared ownership to enable people to get onto the housing ladder, and we do develop outright sale as well, so properties on the open market, the profits for which go back into the development of more ideally social rent and affordable rent housing. We're one of the biggest providers of social rent housing within the UK. Not really going to go a lot over this, but in terms of the kind of the government's welfare reform and the shift to more and more people on universal credit, obviously people on things like universal credit, there can be in-work benefits as well. It's not all people who are unemployed, certainly, but there's a huge number of people, 6 million people and rising on universal credit across the UK at the moment. So that's more than 1 in 10 in terms of working age people. So that'll be people who work for you, it'll be people who work for us. And part of universal credit, part of the remit behind it, was the welfare reform, was to put more personal responsibility onto people in terms of for looking after their finances and for the payment of their kind of household expenditures and their bills. That was one of the things that the government at the time time wanted to introduce. And it's that theme of personal responsibility I want to kind of pick up essentially, because we are, as I've just outlined, we've got an excess of demand for our services, and you have got an excess of demand for your services as well. And one of the things we started thinking about going back, well, initially, I mean, it's 10 years now, believe it or not, was actually we have got an excess of demand in terms of contacts from our residents, in terms of desire for housing, but what role were we playing in the creation of that demand? By which we mean, were we a little bit too paternalistic in how we actually develop and deliver our services? And I use that word there, services. So services that are given by a landlord in our case to a tenant, or in your case, from the health service to a user of that service. And we wanted to think much more about actually, how do we rebalance that relationship? So it's as much more equitable and community-based relationship where it promotes personal responsibility on both sides, but is not about doing things to people. And where we started off, without going into loads of detail, is we took a few of our colleagues, just 3 colleagues actually initially, sent them outside the organisation for 12 weeks, did a bit of mentoring with them and coaching. It's where the concept of Bromford Lab started off, and said, just let's imagine we just reset the housing service. Just imagine you thought about how you would reset the health service or the NHS. We started from the point of what would be the essential components, what were the things we'd want to promote, and how could we promote a better sense of personal responsibility. And one of the things we wanted to explore was around what was the role of conversations within that? How could we move away from just having kind of static, kind of almost policy-led conversations? And I remember actually sitting, observing a colleague who was one of our traditional housing managers, signing up a new tenant to one of our homes, and I'm not criticizing them in any way, because I've probably done that myself as well. They actually just essentially read out the tenancy agreement. There was no concept of building a relationship with that person. And then they were just let away to go and manage their home. And it was very much a policy-led or framework-led, well, I'm not even going to call it relationship, almost a transactional kind of service, rather than something that was building a relational foundation. Now, we had a lot of influences at the time, some of which I think are on this call at the moment. People from Wigan Council, the work that they were doing in adult social care that latterly spread out to the wider local authority about the concept of a Wigan deal, and thinking about, changing attitudes and behaviours, working with place-based teams, having different conversations. That was really interesting to us, and we visited them and shared a lot of learnings between the 2 organisations. We were also inspired by what Hilary Cottam was doing, the work she was doing. And if you haven't read her book, Radical Help, certainly put it on your list, because it's a fantastic book that gives some really powerful examples. There's a chapter in Radical Help where Hilary shadows a guy called Ryan, who was a recently qualified social worker. And she observes that 74% of his time is spent on administration and recording. Only 14% of his time is spent with having conversations with the family that he's meant to be supporting. And that goes back to what I said at the beginning about how we spend our time. So that's what we wanted to do when we looked at kind of relaunching the role at Bromford. We did a very simple experiment when we started Bromford Lab. We took 2 of our existing housing managers and 2 weeks, and we sent them out to start talking to their communities without all the policies and scripts and or even the IT systems that they usually had. So they went out there kind of with some obviously safeguards, but they went out there blind into the community. And the insights they started picking up about people were really interesting. So they were actually, rather than starting saying, well, we know this and this about you, they started asking more questions. They started learning more about the family context, how people were working within the neighbourhood, what was working, what was not working. And they were getting a profoundly different amount of insights from our customers than we would normally get. And that really inspired us, and then started us thinking about, well, actually, how could we kind of build upon that? So we did a range of wider testing with more colleagues and different kinds of tests to actually continue building up our kind of knowledge. And the things we started picking up, first of all, this concept of moving away from parent-child and started thinking about adult relationships and adult conversations and moving away from paternalism. That was something that struck us. We have a tendency within the housing sector, I can't speak for health, but I imagine it's broadly similar, is to looking at people as kind of needing to be fixed and looking at the kind of the worst things that are going on rather than the best things. So we very much started to make a shift into, we can't solve everything. So what are people's strengths? What are strengths within a community? And how can we build upon those strengths? One of the things that we realized there was we had to change our behaviors, essentially, that we had to do far less talking and far less prescription and far more listening. And we'll talk about that in terms of, that's quite challenging for people who've been in a system a certain time, doing things a certain way, to moving into a listening and more empathetic role. I'll come back to the community point, but the main thing was there was a recognition that maybe we should be doing less, and maybe we need to be coaching and connecting people to the things that were already strong within their community. So we did a number of, you can call them kind of tests. We tested kind of service about what was the best way to move people into a neighbourhood. So that would be things like, introducing them to the neighbours, introducing a new mother to the local parent and child club. We did a testing about a more holistic money advice service. We did a test around kind of getting people into employment and having a kind of employment coach so we could connect people to opportunities that were out there. And ultimately, cutting a long story short, we took the best bits that worked from each of those tests and fused them into what we call the neighbourhood coach role. And we tested that role out over a large locality in Lichfield in Staffordshire. We had a control group within the Cotswolds, and the impact we saw within those first pilots were very significant in terms of first of all, the impact on people's kind of well-being, the impact on engagement, but also the positive effects on things like people's ability to keep up with their rental payments and even their kind of reliance on us in terms of ordering additional repairs. So there's some very positive things. And essentially what we did then was to move that and scale that up and roll that out. I love this kind of graphic, and that it goes around the internet quite regularly when they talk about strengths-based working. But this is the main thing for me in terms of what's different about moving to a strengths-based approach. A strength-based approach doesn't ignore the bad things that are going on in the community. It just doesn't become obsessive about all the bad things that go on within communities. So, you might have heard the term misery mapping, but a lot of our organisations, that's exactly what we do. We focus on communities in terms of the levels of loneliness, the levels of kind of mental health issues, the level of, in our case, antisocial behaviour, or the levels of income inequality, which tends to put labels on communities and labels on places and ultimately labels on people that are one aspect of what's going on, but they're not the only thing. So what we've tried to do, and this is the main shift that culturally we've had to make, is to how can we focus on what's working? And even if it's not working brilliantly, how could we build that and how we could support that and how we could connect people to other aspects of that? And that's where the coaches, Amy and Sinead, are going to give you some very practical examples of doing that. So I'm not going to even attempt to steal their thunder because I can't do that. So where we got to, I've picked up on some of this first of all, but I'll just pick up another couple of things here. Part of this is about, moving to being less paternalistic is moving away from kind of judging people's choices, essentially. And it's about having a conversation about some of those choices, but it's certainly not trying to set people up as being like there's a model citizen or there's a kind of ideal customer and there's an ideal behavior. We've tried to move away from doing that. There's, that often happens within social housing, because sometimes that's where the stigma of being a social tenant comes from, because it attaches a lot of very negative attributes to the concept of being a social housing tenant. So it's something that we've had to work with as a sector, but I'm sure it affects aspects of your services as well, whether it's particular communities or whether it's particular, I'll use the word lifestyles, that people have. But we've very much tried to move away from that, and that's been a challenge to us. We'll explore some of that into the in the Q&A. So this is kind of the important point. That's, in traditional housing model is that you'll have a housing manager that supports maybe 750 to 1,000 homes. Our patch size is average at 193 homes, so it's much more intensive, and that's deliberate, because we want to see the neighbourhood coaches as actually part of the community, not something that's just kind of serving the community in a paternalistic way. So that's very much how we've tried to develop and move forward. And we see the neighbourhood coach role. When we've got now over 200 neighbourhood coaches, so it started from sending a couple of people out for a couple of weeks, growing it to over 200. So it's a much bigger model now than it used to be, and they are very much absolutely focused on developing strength-based relationships and getting to know people on an individual and on a collective basis as well. But they're the kind of the community experts, the eyes and the ears of what's going on, and they're very much kind of less of a doer and much more of a connector. That's the kind of the ideal model we've got. And I think, as I said earlier, we often talk about being overwhelmed by demand, but sometimes it's entirely self-created. The services we've tried to move towards focus on, strengths rather than just needs. And, if you don't do that, there's a danger that you foster dependency, which, and then, of course, the more dependency you have, the more demand actually goes up. And so what we've kind of recognized is that we're not going to kind of solve the housing crisis or the crisis in our communities, if we do want to term it a crisis, by just pouring money on these things. What we need to do is to rebuild the roles based upon kind of conversation, relationships, and that does take some time to achieve. So that's my introduction. Thank you very much for that. We're going to have some questions when we come back, but for now, we're going to go into our breakout groups. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the morning. Right, I think everybody's back. Okay, thanks for that. We're just going to have, before we kind of go to the next session, where I'm going to introduce a couple of the neighbourhood coaches, we're just going to have kind of 10 minutes or so just in terms of feeding back on any of the discussion that happened in those rooms. Do you want to go straight to the participants and see if anybody wants to kind of feed back on any of the points rather than me watching on again? Who's going to be brave enough?
I'm happy to speak, Paul.
Please do.
Yeah, I mean, we had a great conversation, Tracy. Syllabile, apologies if I've pronounced it incorrectly. And we were talking about some of the challenges with regards to there not being enough community resources to support someone who needs support with housing, etc., and the challenges that go around that, and the fact that, I mean, obviously she was coming from the basis of it's very difficult to try and home someone who's been in hospital with drug, alcohol abuse, to then house them and then give them that support. And then we went on to talk about, well, if they've got the capacity to engage, then yeah, they can have, they're still eligible for this social support. Once they disengage, i.e., they continue with alcohol and drug abuse, it's sort of like a cycle and it goes round again. Now, I don't know how you find that within Bromford in terms of this cycle having an impact on your social housing and building communities. And, you talked about the skills. Let's look at what the skills the skill set is within your community, do you think that has an impact on having sort of like a positive community environment?
I think it absolutely does, and it was picked up in our group as well. I think when we introduce Amy and Sinead, I think we'll get onto some of those topics in terms of how do we prevent those kind of things. One of the things that, you know, I reflected on in my group is that we had to recognise that the way we trained our people and the way, you know, needed to change. Essentially, there were some people who couldn't adapt to an approach that's far less prescriptive in terms of how do you break out of those kind of cycles. So we did a kind of lot of work, and we picked up some work that had been happening specifically in women's prisons around kind of coaching to get people out of kind of cycles of the kind of release from prison, back in prison, release from prison, back in prison. How do you kind of break the cycle? I'll be honest with you, a lot of our staff colleagues didn't like that change in approach because they found it too challenging. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of them, not a lot of them, but some people moved on. Some people took to it like ducks to water. This is the kind of work we've always wanted to do. Some people didn't. And then we had another conversation in our group as well. And I forgot who said it, so I apologise for not remembering the name, but about how sometimes they are the service user needs to be broken out of that cycle themselves, in the sense of they're being used to being provided with lots of services. That's what they've grown up with. So, you know, the NHS has grown into a kind of something that provides a load of services to the public. Housing associations exactly the same. Instilling responsibility on the person to change things about their own lifestyle or behaviours is not always a welcome message at all. And so I think it's a really challenging approach, but we've had to do a lot more in terms of our kind of how we coach our coaches and how we kind of support them. And particularly the bit that Amy and Sinead will talk about, you know, how we've tried to instill them. They're the focal point of the customer relationship, essentially. They're the ones who've got a kind of, you know, they've got the autonomy and they've got the kind of, you know, the remit to start, you know, helping people break out of those cycles. In the beginning, I'll be honest with you, we had a lot of complaints from customers about the way they were being spoken to, about, you know, you're not doing these things for me. And we had to go through a kind of period of kind of sustaining that, because if we just went back into, well, yeah, we will, you know, we're really sorry we've upset you, we'll do these things for you. We're going back into a kind of reactive service-led approach.
I think you're right. I think we do sort of like have this nanny state in this country, don't we? And interestingly, within our breakout group as well, we talked about, you know, when you were saying about we have this mentality of wanting to fix people. Is it sometimes that we need to do that because some people haven't got the capacity to fix themselves?
Absolutely. And I think what we've reserved, you know, now is that we recognise there are some people for whom, you know, they are much more, you know, vulnerable. We try not to use that word because it's been used too liberally in our sector, at least. But, you know, there are some people who do require that kind of additional support, and we do have to do those things, but actually it shouldn't be our default way of operating. And I think that's the kind of thing that we've had to kind of move to. That's a great point. Thank you. Is there anything else anyone wants to bring out the breakouts? Does anyone else want to pick up anything that came in their particular group that was different?
I'm happy to feedback, Paul, from Sarah and my conversation. So we have a little list about the things that we think don't enable. Aversion to risk at all levels. That we've moved away from relationship-based interactions to process-led interactions with checklists and report structures, and some of the constraints we put on people of condensing the richness of a conversation into something that fits in 2 lines of a report, and that's meant to capture it all. Systems and infrastructure don't enable responsiveness. And I'm going to say 2 things that might be controversial. An increasing number of individuals who maybe haven't got the level of experience to make autonomous decisions. That heavy reliance on protocol and process measures rather than lived experience, and lived experience as a practitioner, as a manager, as a leader, or whatever. And I can speak from health. We're seeing a real loss of years of experience. And whilst you don't need experience to be good at what you do, what it does give you is a breadth of experiences to draw on that helps you see pattern. If you don't have that, you don't see pattern, you can't intervene. And I'm speaking specifically from my background as a midwife. Something around a lack of knowledge of community is a constraint. So you don't understand what your assets are. Not using data well, and a failure to create a permissive culture of decision making. And that comes right from the top down, because you're defending decisions rather than having them enabled when they work outside of what is seen to be usual and normal. And then the last bit is, and I thought this was brilliant from Sarah, which is, you know, have we lost the sense of what is legitimate work? And what we talked about there was the richness and value of conversation and interaction, as opposed to it being driven by that checklist approach. And anybody that's rung 111 will know, you know, I'm on the phone, am I breathing? And, you know, have I, you know, actually I'm talking to you, so I am definitely breathing here. So there is just something about, you know, how do we free up from some of that without creating unnecessary risk, but actually starting to be more innovative and creative.
Those are absolutely great, Sue. I think that there's a couple of things I was going to say, but I think that leads into the next session very nicely, where we're going to introduce Amy and Sinead, two of our neighbourhood coaches. I think Amy's going to talk first, essentially. What we're going to ask them to do is to give kind of 5 minutes each in terms of what's the practical experience of being a kind of neighbourhood coach, and what are the kind of conversations that happen out there that they think are beneficial to kind of the health and wellbeing agenda. And interesting, just picking up your last point, Sue, I shadowed Amy a few weeks back in an area that I used to work in about 15 years ago, and it's quite a problematic area, or was a problematic area. Amy has done some amazing things in terms of turning that community around and helping that community turn itself around. And one of the things I reflected on, I didn't say this to Amy actually, she's sitting opposite me now so she can hear what I'm saying, is that your last point, Sue, about actually how we kind of value that kind of relational aspect of work, and even is it work essentially, you know, and do we value some aspects of work more than others? I did say, if you watched how Amy was working and you didn't know what she was doing, you could think she was just walking around the community all day, having a nice time, just having conversations with people here, sitting on the sofa here, going and talking to someone about their gardening over there. Because unless you understood what she's actually doing, which is kind of coaching, connecting, rather than just providing services, that is actually a really valuable thing to do, but it's often not valued within the workplace as kind of meaningful work. And that's something we've had to do a lot in terms of culturally about valuing that kind of preemptive work. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Right, I'm going to shut up. I'm going to let Amy talk for a little bit. We'll give them kind of 5 minutes each to talk about their role, and then I'll add to the Q&A.
Can you just let them know she's talking from mine?
Yeah, say that talking from Katie's laptop.
Okay. Hi everyone. So my name's Amy, and I currently am a neighbourhood coach in part of the Wolverhampton area. So as part of my role, I was saying it's very it's very preemptive. So with me, I try and get to know my customers as much as possible, build that relationship so they feel like they can have an open and honest relationship with me. So that'll, a lot of my customers, you know, do have mental health issues, and, you know, I'll get to a point where they'll tell me signs of, you know, when they're going through, you know, a bad part of their health. So with one customer last year who has got schizophrenia, he's very, very quietly spoken, lovely man. And then I called him one day and he started shouting down the phone, very nicely still, but being very loud. So I was like, oh, is everything okay with you? And he was like, yeah, I'm fine. And I was like, I don't know if it is. So I was like, can I pop round to see you? And he was like, yeah. And I went round and I could clearly see he hadn't been taking his medication. And I, you know, called the local hospital, and he hadn't been taking his medication for about a month. It turned out he'd thrown all his furniture out of the flat, destroyed it all, so we had nothing in his flat. So we had a spell in hospital, came out, and he was okay again. And then recently it started happening again, and I thought, right, okay, I've seen the signs now, so I know to get in there as soon as possible, stop him losing all his belongings again, because he hasn't got much money either. So building back his, you know, up his property to where it was previously, he was struggling, which we did help via grants. Started happening straight away, got in contact with the hospital, they took him in, and God bless him, he loves his cat as well, and his cat was stuck in the property. So I went like over and above to try and find somebody that would take his cat for him, because I knew that would have such a negative impact on him getting himself well, because all he was worried about was his cat, because that's his little like baby and his companion. So we've got that sorted. And so, yeah, so because I got to know that customer so well, I knew the symptoms to start looking for early intervention. And then another really good, I mean, as I say, you do this job and you don't realise just how like much of an impact you are having on people. You know, we're there to try and empower them to be the, you know, the best that they want to be in whatever circumstance. And the second one was this lady that had lived on the scheme I managed for, I think, 26 years. She'd never met anybody from Bromford, bar the people that were doing like repairs, etc., because that was the old housing manager role. So I met with her and she was telling me about her love for like gardening, etc. And then there was a new customer that had just moved in, and I knew she really liked gardening. So when we were all outside, I kind of started getting them talking, discussed about a UCAN grant that Bromford do, where we can put them forward to get a certain amount of money, and then they can take on whatever they want to do, like gardening. So they were like buying plants and all the stuff they wanted to do with the gardening. And the lady that had lived there for 26 years had never spoken to a neighbour before. And she's now, because I got to know them both, and I knew they both really, really enjoyed gardening. They're best friends. They've both got no family, no friends before this. They're now best friends. They've got a little gardening club. The scheme looks absolutely amazing because it's always flowering. And Jan, the lady that had lived there for so long, has actually started speaking to other people now, and she doesn't feel lonely or isolated. She's out there, you know, she feels like confident to go and speak to somebody new on the scheme, whereas before she was just like, oh, I don't want to speak to them, I don't know who they are. Whereas now, because I'm there so often as well, and she can see that I'm talking to them, and she'll just come over and she'll be like, hi, and then they'll see if they want to get in, you know, get them into the gardening club. And you know, it's and what's happened there is they're all talking, and there's houses opposite, and all the houses are now actually engaging with all the flat people in the flats as well. There's not that barrier where like, we're houses, your flats. And you know, it's made them want to make their gardens look nice because they've seen that, and you know, they're all helping each other out. And this is a scheme that Paul came with me on, that years ago 2 people would have to attend to go on there because of the high level of crime. And now there is absolutely, for 3 years, there's been, well, 4 years, I think, there's been nothing at all. It's just coasts nicely. So yeah.
So just on that, you turn the volume down, Katie. Yeah. Okay, just on that then, Amy. As you say, so you kind of succeeded there, where I had myself and a team of people to help manage that estate, essentially. So you've succeeded where we failed 15 years ago, essentially. Jan, who you referred to, didn't engage with us at all. It was high antisocial behaviour. There was high instances of kind of mental health and drug abuse on that estate. What do you think have been the kind of the key things that have been different in your ability to manage it that we didn't have?
I think it was me being a prominent person on there, so they felt like I was part of their community. So I wasn't just there telling them this, that, because the old housing manager, it would be very much, you only ever saw them if you were kind of in a rent arrears or in trouble. Whereas I've gone in and I've made a very solid effort to go in there, know the family, the names of the pets, the kids, what the kids do, what school they go to, just having around just like a knowledge of what their life is. And also they can call me directly, whereas it's not going to Bromford Housing. They've got a personal connection with me, so it's like, right, let's call Amy, and they'll call me and they'll, about whatever. And they know that whatever I say, they know I'm going to do my best for them. So it's about having that kind of mutual respect as well. And as I say, they see me as part of their community, so they know if they're frustrated about something, I'm going to be frustrated about it.
I think that's the key thing there. I'll go on to Sinead in a minute. Tracy, have you got your hand up? Do you want to say something, ask a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to, a couple of things. First of all, I suppose it's at what stage are people at that readiness to be able to do that? And, I do think we have this very paternalistic approach from a health and social care perspective. We talked about risk, and I know you talked about that, Paul, as well, around the risk level, but I suppose there is also understandably that level of risk, isn't it, and consideration of that when you've got the learning coming out from Safeguarding Adult reviews, where they talk about individuals potentially not being supported, or organisations not wrapping that support around people. Very much, I suppose, in opposition, I would suggest, to what's been discussed here. So I suppose it's that element of it, isn't it, around that element. Secondly, that element of, do people need to be in a certain receptive state to be able to engage with that and take things forward? And number three, what's the impact on you, Katie, and where do you get your supervision?
Do you want to answer anything, Paul, or shall I just?
You go.
Okay. I mean, my leader's absolutely amazing. So I mean, I don't know if it's just my personality, but I've always just been a people person. So I allow customers. Some customers aren't straight up wanting to disclose everything, and they're kind of a little bit like on the back step, like, why do you want to know so much kind of about me? So it is just baby steps with some people, and I'm just there like, you know what, that's absolutely fine. I'm here, you've got my number, you contact me when you want me to. If you need me, I'm here, and that's it. And I take a step back. I've had some customers that have taken 2 years before they've even wanted to kind of let me through the front door, and I'm like, that's absolutely fine, you do it in your own time. And they've watched me on the scheme, say, and they can see I'm not there like, with a hand, a stick in my hand. I'm there like just wanting to get to know people and wanting them to thrive in their community. So yeah, and then if I ever have any issues or anything, as I say, I just go to my leader, to be honest, if I feel like I need any support. But Bromford are a really good customer, and wellbeing is their top priority, especially for their staff members. So I've never really not felt supported. So yeah.
Amy, could I just come in there?
Yeah.
So this goes to the point that was made previously as well, in terms of kind of how when I entered housing, we recruited almost exclusively from people who had studied housing. In fact, that was the remit. You had to be a housing person to get into housing. In fact, I can say, because I know it, I was the first person at Bromford to be recruited from outside the kind of the housing pool. So I'm just wanted to get that in there, Amy. But your background is, it's worth saying what that was, isn't it? We've tried to recruit people. Sue made this point earlier, who've got a mix of life experience and kind of relational work in them rather than just academic work. And we do recognise the importance of academic work, absolutely, but that relational aspect is really important. Do you want to say anything about that, Amy?
Yeah, I was going to say, I came from a background of being a manager of a betting shop, so very different, which has helped me obviously with the frontline face-to-face stuff and pulling on my own experiences. The reason why I came to work for Bromford was I was a single mum and I was homeless. And Bromford gave me my first home when my daughter was only like 3. So that was such a positive impact on my life that when my daughter went to high school, I was like, right, I want to follow the path where I've always been excited, what I've always been excited about, and that was getting into housing, because I wanted to make a difference to people as they had made a difference to myself. And that's how it all became that I wanted to work for Bromford. And I didn't start in as a neighbourhood coach. I started in the income part of it, but I knew my end goal would be to do this role, because this is where like my heart lies, is very customer based. So, and I wanted to make a positive change and show people and empower them to know that it doesn't matter about your background. There's always, you can move forward. And I'm a result of that. I've not got any, apart from GCSEs, I've just worked my way up.
That's great, Amy. Have we got Sinead on the call? Is she here?
I am here.
Great, okay. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you think the impacts have been and some of your kind of stories? And then we'll have some more questions.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I was just soaking in everything Amy was saying there. Well done, lovely. You've done such a fantastic job. And I guess from doing that, Amy, you have the empathy of the lived experience of knowing what that looks like. So that's going to be really impactful for customers. I mean, for me, my patch is slightly different. It's lots of young families, single parents. Lots of my customers when I started were young single mums who were moving into an area that they didn't know, whether it was breakdown in relationships, fleeing domestic abuse. There was lots of that stuff really. And when I started on that patch, there was a lot of antisocial behaviour, mostly by young people or cases of domestic abuse. So that was kind of my goal, was just trying to get known really. I was quite fortunate. I'd worked in education for 16 years, so I knew quite a lot of the families already. So I was lucky that they already knew my face, but it was usually for the wrong reason. So that was the downside of that. But some of the lovely things that we've been able to do, so where we've seen sort of young mums really struggling, and it's scary when you've just had a baby and you're on your own and you don't know where anything is and you don't have the family support. And often, that's purely because of distance or time or because people are working. So one of my favourite things about the job is we get to go and do a home visit. And in that home visit, we're not there really to do anything other than to get to know these people. We want to check their affordability, but that's not the purpose of the visit. It's so we can find out who the person is. So one of my favourite questions is just tell me a little bit about yourself. And they're expecting me to start checking their bank statements and going through all of that. And it's a really difficult thing. I've had it done to me and it's hard because you say things like, oh, I'm just a mum. So my day just, revolves around washing and feeding. And that's when you start to dig a bit deeper and find out the things that they wanted to do when they were at school and were excited about. But, now all of that's gone down the pan and there's all these things that they would like to do and these future plans. So I linked all of these young women together. And one of them just so happened to work for Cafe Nero and she was on maternity leave, but she had a discount card. and all of these young ladies were having to live on benefits. So the idea of going to Cafe Nero and not having to pay full whack was quite an exciting thing for them. So the first meeting I facilitated because nobody knew each other at that point. So we all sat at a table with lots of mums with babies and introduced each other, had a lovely latte, and from little acorns, big oaks grew. So this group that started off with about 4 young mums grew into about 9 young mums. Every new young mum that moved onto the street, they were more than happy to invite into their coffee club. The really sad thing about that is all of their children now are in school. Most of them are working part-time or full-time around the children's hours. But the really impactful thing about that group is almost all of those young ladies were taking some form of antidepressant when I met them. And 18 months into their coffee group, only one of them was still having to take antidepressants. And actually, it wasn't an antidepressant, it was an anti-anxiety medication. But to have gone from them waiting weeks and weeks and weeks for a wellbeing call, there was quite a lot that was done in the beginning because the midwifery and health visitor service do quite a lot with postnatal depression. But at a certain point, that kind of pulls away. So that's when I found that this group meant that not only were they not calling into services and having to ring to get help from wellbeing services, but they were also supporting other people who felt the way that they did. So we identified that that was quite a big deal. Neighbourhood coaching is great because you get to know all of your assets in the community, and because we've only got small patches, we have time to meet with all of those people, so we know what's going on. In Lichfield, we've got Charnwood Children's Centre. They have fantastic things that are going on there. The service now works from 0 to 19 rather than 0 to 5, which means it opens up a much bigger range for our families. But I sit on a younger person's forum, and we knew that young mums and subsequent, mothers with troublesome teenagers who were struggling to get them into school, there was no activity, especially after COVID, because they'd done nothing. So we worked and we put out a cry for help, and we got this fabulous team of people. We got an elite boxer from Birmingham called Wayne Elcock, who specifically we had like sort of 11 to 17-year-old boys who were engaging in behaviours that were just really, really worrying. So Wayne has taken them under his wing, and he coaches them twice a week at boxing up on a little multi-use games area, which is next to our homelessness accommodation. So we have that running on a Thursday. We have a multi-sports that runs for 7 to 12-year-olds from 5:30 to 6:30, and then from 12 to 17-year-olds from 6:30 to 7:30. That runs every Tuesday. But we noticed that our girls weren't attending these groups, and they were in risky situations. So we started a group called Us Girls. So it's for 9 to 13-year-old girls at the moment. It runs every Friday night. I'm a volunteer there. It's just myself and another girl, Tasmin. And that's from 7:30 to 9 o'clock every Friday, come rain or shine. Last week we did football. The week before that we had a pamper night. So this group of 9 girls get to decide what they want to do, and we plan it and we do it. But the engagement from their families now, because it has taken off a lot of the pressure of the worry of where their children are and who they're engaging with and what they're doing, means that they're more engaged with Bromford. They're more engaged with me because they know I care about their kids and what their kids are doing and keeping them safe. So my ASB cases at the moment, I think I started with about 12. I've got 1 at the moment, which is not really related to my customer, but because of the circumstance, it's had to be open. But everything starts with a conversation, and that's my favourite thing. Everything is just a conversation, and I love having conversations. So I get paid for doing something that I love to do.
I love that thing you just said about everything starts with a conversation. I mean, you gave an example yesterday, didn't you? Was it a conversation with, like, was it care worker about a gentleman who wasn't taking his medication as well?
Well, no, weirdly, it's a cleaner. So I've got a customer who's in his 50s, but he's very childlike, has really complex needs, but due to a really difficult background, just ended up not being picked up by anybody really. They believe he's on the autistic spectrum. He has 2 words that he uses, yeah or no, and that is it. But he's got heart failure. So he ended up in hospital for quite a period of time, and obviously that level of change was really difficult for him. So the cleaner called me because we organised that a cleaner would go in a couple of times a week because he didn't however this happened, he didn't meet the criteria for carers, which, okay, yes. So we got cleaners involved, and the cleaners called me because this gentleman drinks 2 days a week. So on a Sunday and a Monday, that's it. After that, he won't have any other alcohol until the following Sunday. But he'd got quite drunk and had unfortunately wet the bed, and there was blood in the urine. So the cleaners had come in, obviously really struggled to communicate with him. I've been working with him for 6 years now, so we've got a good relationship. So they called me and said, you know, could you talk to him, because I think he probably needs to see a doctor. And he flat out refused to see a doctor. So we spent about half an hour talking to him, myself and a colleague that works at the council, and reminded him that the last time he left something so long that he got really poorly that he ended up in hospital for 8 weeks. So would he rather we put in a call to the doctor and perhaps just get some tablets or see before he got so ill that he needed to go into hospital? So he's given me, I've got permission to speak to the doctors on his behalf. So that's been sorted. So the doctors called me back. We had a conversation, booked in an appointment, was able to sort out a urine sample, dropped it off to the doctors, and now there's no catastrophe. But in the absence of us having that relationship, 1, we wouldn't have known about that. 2, he'd have carried on being quite isolated. His neighbours are fantastic. We've linked him into his neighbours, who are lovely leaseholders, by the way. So whenever there's a problem that he doesn't know how to fix, he just bangs on this floor 3 times and they pop up to check on him, which is just brilliant. And I'm not sure if he was living with his dad, and his dad sadly passed away, and we weren't sure that he was going to be able to maintain a tenancy. But since that's happened, he's done a fabulous job. His dad was a hoarder, and he was able to get Wintertons to come in. It wasn't rubbish that he was hoarding, it was all valuable things, coins, cougarans, there was all sorts there. And through that sale, through Wintertons, he got quite a lump sum of money, and that enabled him to completely clear the flat, new carpets, new furniture. The only thing that he wouldn't allow us to do is to change anything in his dad's room, other than to get rid of, you know, his bed, etc., etc. But all of his clothes are still there and laid out like they always were before. But the flat's beautiful now. So when I started working there was a lawnmower and an engine in the bath. So it was quite the challenge. But I really enjoyed working with those guys. I miss his dad terribly because he was a real character. But at the end of the day, it's just a conversation. They can make their own decisions. We're not there to tell them what to do. We're just there to ask if they think there's another way, if what they're doing at that time is probably not conducive with managing their tenancy well.
That's, I mean, those, I mean, honestly, listen, I work with the same organisation, but I don't think even in our own organisation we tell those stories enough, because just hearing what, you know, a couple of what you've both said is really inspiring to me, and I can see from the comments it's inspiring to others as well. And it's just making me think there, you know, thinking out loud here, it does show that at the time we'd over-professionalised the services, and we'd made it kind of almost too much of a kind of professional service, and lacking that relational aspect you've just described. Right, we've got about 15 minutes, and it'd be great to have some questions for Amy and Sinead while they're with us, or any kind of comments. So I'll pass it over to you. So it could be questions or comments. It'd probably useful if people put their hands up, actually, and then we can decide who's got a question and put them forward. You just go to the bottom and put a reaction icon. Oh, Sue, you've got your hand up and Tracy's got a hand up.
So as you can tell, I still can't work this flipping thing out where hands are and loves and everything anyway. So I'll go back to old fashioned and putting my hand up. What I'm really interested in is it's the interface between the boundary of your space and where that interfaces with the work boundary. Because what you've prompted for me is, in the olden days, and it is olden days, I used to be a midwife, and I shared with Sarah, you know, I had no issue giving my personal number to women. They never abused it. But when they rang me out of hours, I was able to pick the phone up and maybe stop them whizzing the baby out the window because it wouldn't fix on the breast for a feed at 3 a.m. or whatever. And I had no issue with that. I think if I practice like that now, I'm likely to get referred to the NMC for breaching some sort of professional rules or something. But what I've heard in you is that very essence of humanity, and it's so inspiring. And that's where we make the difference, because we connect on a human level. But I just wonder how you manage the personal and the work bit.
Do you want to go, Amy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so I do inform my customers that, you know, I am human, got my own family. So my phone, you know, my phone is off on a weekend, but they've got all the numbers for any form of emergency. So they'll have, you know, Bromford out of hours, and, you know, my manager can contact me if there's an emergency, which has happened before, and it's up to me if I've wanted to go and attend, because there always is like an emergency group that will go and attend. And I've gone like, absolutely, you know, I want my customers to know I'm experiencing this with them because it was a fire. And so I've gone out, but my phone goes off at 5, 5:30. Customers are aware of that, and they know that they can WhatsApp me, text me, leave a voicemail, and next day I'm there with them. And as I say, anybody that needs that additional help, they've got the contact numbers, and I'll, you know, make sure that they know where they can call to get that help if I'm not available. Sinead?
I mean, I live quite close to my patch, so when I go shopping, there's, without a doubt, I will bump into customers. My kids go to the same school that their children go to, so, and I probably helped out at one of the schools in 16 years that they went to, or their brother went to, or so my face is known, and it has been for a really long time. It's not unknown for me to walk through town and hear, Miss Mac, Miss, and I'm sure you understand that, Sue. Like, I saw my midwife who helped me with my 2 children in the co-op the other day, and then we were on a child in need meeting sort of the day after, and I was like, oh, Shirley, aren't you lucky you've got me twice in 1 week? So that really is the thing for me, the whole essence of coaching, and this is what we tell our customers all of the time, is that we are here, but we are here not to fix things for you. We are here to help you fix things for yourself. So when you are calling me, I want you to have asked yourself, what have I done to try and resolve this first? Because if when I ask you that and you say, call me, then that's not coaching. If you've gone, well, listen, I've tried to do this and I've tried to do that and I still haven't got an answer, I go, great. Well, then it's perfect. Now it's time for me to jump in on this. Let's see if we can think of something together. But that's the difference. It is very, very prominent that we are not, we're proactive, not reactive. We have a relationship with you, not because something's going on in your life, but because you are our customer. And we want you to know that we're here, and we want to know what your family looks like, who your cheerleading squad is. So when things go wrong, who are those people that you go to? Because then if we find out something's gone wrong and we don't know, then we know where you will go to get that support. Because if you don't have that support network, that's when we're going to worry, and that's when we start looking at referrals. And those are all the things that we talk about. On the day of the sign up, I say to them, you are signing this piece of paper to give me permission to share information about you and your family, about your tenancy, as we are duty bound to do so by law, or if we think it's in your best interests. So if I'm worried about you, I'm going to do something about that. So at the point where we have to do these referrals and people get really cross, and they get so cross with us, I always go, do you remember when we did that first sign up and I told you I am duty bound in my job? If I am worried about you, I need to do something about that. That can be talking to you about it, or it can be talking to someone else about it. But my goal is always to make sure you're okay.
That's great. So sorry, just getting some feedback from somewhere. Okay, I think that's sorted. Yeah, that's what's great. Just before I go to Tracy, just the point there, just picking up Sue's point about the boundaries. That is a real challenge, absolutely. And I think we've had to do a lot in the organisation in terms of kind of to check the balances between the kind of safeguarding, keeping the organisation safe and keeping the customer safe. And to give you an example of that, I knew that we were starting to go wrong when you had, this is before we had the coaching model, where colleagues would start saying, I don't want customers coming up to me in Sainsbury's to talk about their case. I want to change patch so I'm away from my customers. There's something seriously gone wrong here, because we're meant to be a community-based organisation, essentially. So how do we get around that? But you're absolutely right. As Sinead has said, it's about then equipping the people, frontline people, to be able to have those conversations about when is appropriate and when's inappropriate in terms of contact. But also to pick up your points here very quickly, we've had that as well. When we were going through our transformation programme, a lot of our consultants were saying you must close down WhatsApp for customer contact. It is not right that you've got all this contact going out in someone else's channel. And our neighbourhood coaches and our localities teams basically said, over our dead bodies, are you taking us away from those contacts? Because we need to be responding to community need and the channels that they need sometimes as much as anything else. Now that is a challenge for us, but we have to think about how we manage that, because as you're absolutely right, those are the kind of things that could be seen as unprofessional conduct. So it's almost about, this is our purpose. How do we get a governance arrangement internally that protects us and safeguards us as an organisation? But actually, it is the customer who needs to come first, ultimately. And how do we design services around that? But I'll pick that up in the last session. Sorry, Tracy, you've got a hand up. Tracy, I think you're on mute. Tracy might have. Oh, she's on.
Sorry, do you know what it was? Somebody just gave me a quick call from work. So, I was going. You're
okay. So it's the first one of the day, so we're doing well.
Oh my God. No, what I wanted to ask was, in terms of obviously this model, because it does strike me that, I'll put my camera back on because it's when you're talking, it seems rude otherwise. I was just thinking though, in terms of sort of the work that's going on here around how well known this is known across safer community partnership meetings from local authorities. Because for me, I just kind of wonder whether, because we know, talking about this engagement, the counselling, the coaching, reduction in ASBOs and all that kind of stuff around, how well this is known and whether that needs to be on agenda. What I would do is, Paul, if that's okay with you, is that I'm proposing to actually contact the chair of our Sefton Safer Together, which is our Sefton Safer Community Partnership, to say that I've been on this event, and actually, is this something that we can look at? Maybe a presentation coming to that from yourselves. Is that something that you would have the appetite for, Paul, or even the time? And or Sinead and others who sort of people that are on this call who work for your organisation, who could kind of demonstrate the benefits, because actually, we all struggle with some of these things.
Sorry,
yeah, sorry, you go, Sinead.
In Lichfield, we sit on that. Bromford sit on that. It's the only housing association that does in the community safety partnership, but we sit on that hub in Lichfield.
Bromford, I don't think it's in Liverpool, is it?
No, we're not. We're not that far. So in terms of I'll answer on behalf of Sinead and Amy. We are willing to do that and continue these conversations, and that's the value we're getting. Because just speaking to you guys today, it's giving me thoughts about things as well. Where we are kind of across Bromford, we've been running this model for some time now. We've made a commitment to it and our next strategy going forward. But we're now keen to have conversations with people, not that it will benefit Bromford, because it won't, because we don't operate in your area, but to think about the wider agenda here, about how does housing, health, social care connect up to, to make sure that we don't quash the kind of things that we've been talking about this morning, but we kind of enable them and build them. So we're quite happy to have those conversations. When we started this model, it was always my hope that it would develop into a kind of national framework. It hasn't. However, there are more people interested in it now than there were 5 years ago. So that's a good thing. Evelyn, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, my video's cutting on and off, so I'm just leaving it off.
That's okay.
I think the work Sinead and Amy have done is fantastic. I think it's amazing. When I worked in Stockport about 10 years ago, we rolled out a restorative model. And it's very, very much like that. We do for, not we don't do for, we do with rather than for or to, and it's a great mindset getting people to change that. But one of the problems that I noticed was that it's fine rolling it out to health and social care, housing, health boards and things like that. But if you don't roll that model out to the complete authority or the complete people that use it, you're fighting a losing battle. There's no point, and I brought this up in our discussion, there's no point in all the social workers and all the healthcare professionals and all the housing professionals knowing about it if the people that answer the phones down in reception don't know anything about it, or the people that deal with your council tax benefits that don't know anything about it. Everybody needs to be trained on it. And one of the other concerns, or not concerns, but issues that I've noticed with it as well, due to staff turnover, it's a constant education for new starters, for everybody that joins, whatever your authority is or whatever organisation you have. So while that whole model, the restorative model and working with people works great for the first 2 or 3 years, by that time you start to get staff turnover and people are joining the authority and they're saying, well, what's restorative? Is that when you go to court and speak to somebody? They don't know what the whole model is. So I just think unless you've got a sort of national recruiting agency to train these people, maybe that's what your way forward, Paul, to embed it nationally, open a recruiting agency and train people properly to do it. I don't know.
Well, that's not a bad idea, actually. I mean, you're absolutely correct in the sense that we recognise as an organisation now, and obviously there've been a lot of coaches that have been recruited since Sinead and Amy who haven't been on the same journey, and equally a lot of people have been recruited to Bromford. So you're absolutely right. I mean, even getting it to work in your own organisation is a challenge. Never mind the point you just made about actually getting a kind of a whole systems approach. But I'm a glass half full kind of person, and I think that's the agenda we need to keep pushing at, essentially. Because for the reasons that we talked about earlier, I don't think we have much choice as organisations but to probably engage in that way. So, yeah, I haven't got all the answers, and I think it's just a continuing conversation we'll need to have about how we continue to move in that direction rather than, go back to the old paternalism. Any other questions or points for particularly Amy or Sinead? Because we're going to be around for a little bit longer. Any final questions?
Sorry, yeah. Could I just ask?
Deborah.
So when you did did you do a job description, Paul, in terms of, the skills and stuff that you were looking for when you were, looking to recruit your neighbourhood coaches? Was that something that you'd drawn together, and how did it come about? How did the role come about?
Yeah, well, as I said before, it was incremental. So what we did in the early stages was just like almost get two of the pilot people to write their own job description, just to say about what did they think were the things that were. It was quite radical at the time, actually, but it was almost like, write what you think is having the impacts here, and we'll work kind of backwards essentially, and then develop some kind of measurements around that. I think you're constantly going to keep an eye on those kind of things, actually, because I'm being completely honest with you. I saw a latest neighbourhood coach job description the other day, and I thought it had lost something. It had lost something from the original kind of thing, because a lot of those more kind of organisational prescriptive measures had gone back in, and things can happen, can't they, with JDs, that you get kind of like creeped, and all of a sudden you think, hold on, that isn't the real purpose of the job. The purpose of the job, Sinead and Amy have just described the purpose of the job, and sometimes it works on those. So it's a constant challenge, I think, and I think, what we've recognised as an organisation, there needs to be some torchbearers across the organisation who hold the vision of coaching and what we mean by strengths-based working. It hasn't got to be everybody. But if we've got a few people who can be on the watch out for what's the signs where we become a little bit, where the mind the mind is shifting and we're becoming a little bit too corporate. It still happens. I'm not going to say it's I've recognised, we're going to talk about innovation next, but I've recognised from an innovation point of view, with things like this, you can never walk away. It's never job done. You've constantly got to think about, actually, how do you drive this agenda forward? Because even if the CEO is singing and dancing about it and everything, the system in the organisation will often veer back to, operational efficiency, essentially, and focus very much around that. So it's a balance between the two. So it's a job that's never done, but I think it's something we need to keep pushing at.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. Appreciate that.
Any final question before I allow Sinead and Amy to leave? Or you can stay. You're welcome to stay, by the way, and hear the rest of the conversation. Okay, so
as lovely as that would be, I've got customers I've got to go and walk around on patch.
They are much more important than us, so we will allow you to do it. But thanks for that. I'm sure people have found that. Well, I've certainly found
absolutely.
It. And I think.
Thank you so much, Sinead and Amy. That was brilliant.
Lovely to meet you guys.
And you.
Take care.
Okay.
Thank
so
you.
For the next kind of 35 minutes, we're going to now talk about kind of approaches that kind of, from an innovation perspective, that kind of support this agenda and push the organisation forward. So Katie's going to spend kind of 10 minutes briefly just talking about some of the kind of principles of how we engage colleagues in developing ideas within Bromford. Then I'll kind of pick it up from a kind of more kind of future focus period and say kind of where next this agenda. So over to you, Katie.
Thank you. I really don't want to follow Amy and Sinead, to be honest. They speak so well, and they attended one of our strategy directorate meetings recently, and they just blew our minds. So thank you. I'm saying thank you, and especially for Sinead and Amy in the room. So I just wanted to give a bit of an overview of Bromford Lab, what we do, and how innovation works at Bromford. So bit of an overview. Bromford Lab was established. Oh, Paul.
Sorry.
Bromford Lab was established in 2014 by Paul, and actually was the first innovation lab in our sector. So when we started Bromford Lab, or I should say Paul, we wanted to help fix things, solve poor problem definition, and really understand, some of the problems across the business that, needed fixing, or how we could potentially fix some of these issues. With the slide above, we decided that going forward, the way our process would somewhat work, it changes constantly, is somebody having an idea within the business. Then we actually take that idea and we want to do something about it. We actually want to build something. One thing we always said was prototype more, test often, and pilot less. So we build and iterate on everything we did. We also believe in evidence-based research. So we take all of our learnings and hope that we get some good data and be able to kind of prove what we're trying to do. And then we'll translate it into reality and make it a part of every day. So that in essence is, hopefully we implement it. Next slide, please. So what we want to do as Bromford Lab is we try and grow the best ideas and ditch the bad ones. We often talk about failing fast, which is one of our founding principles. We basically wanted to remove the fear of failure and just basically open it up to say this is a non-judgment zone. No idea is a bad idea. You know, bring them all to us. So we often put this slide in to say avoiding silver bullet solutions, just in say that it's, you know, doing those small experiments is the best way to kind of get your knowledge and get your data to kind of help you move on. If you go on to the next slide, please. So one thing we wanted to do, which we learned, is that when it comes to testing ideas, we needed to get better at it. So these are kind of the things that we stuck to. So we wanted to get quicker. We wanted the duration of it to be little. So we was like, what can we do tomorrow? What can we do by the end of next week? Like, how quickly can we get some answers and some valuable data that we need? Cost, keep it to a minimal, because I think that's obviously when people start to get a little bit kind of touchy. If you eat into budgets, it's just not going to work. So we kept the cost as minimal as possible. Resource, we did it as small as possible. So we tried to kind of test everything out with the least amount of cost, least amount of resource, but just get as much data as we possibly could. And then if you go to the next slide, this is where I'll probably talk a little bit more. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to kind of have an area where we could have ideas and things coming from across the business in one specific place. So I don't know if this is something that is common across most organisations, but we certainly found it at Bromford. Was colleagues
did like trust having their babies, but carrying a little pen and
paper. So we found that colleagues felt like they weren't being listened to. So we implemented this an ideas platform, very originally named, where we could have ideas come through and we'd see it all from across the business. So this is how we would define some of the ideas that were coming through. So we'd get a lot of simple ideas, so they could be tackled quite quickly. As we was talking about in the previous slide, it'd be like low resource and low costs, you know, that safe to fail environment. And then we'd have more complex ideas come through where, you know, things weren't clear and they would need a little bit of time and resource. And they would probably, you know, need some research and more thinking out. And then the future ideas is what we're looking at, how we're going to be kind of working in the future, what kind of things that customers are going to be having in their homes, technology, all that kind of thing. And then if we move on to the next slide, I'll talk a bit about our ideas platform. I'll try and give some examples as well. So when we launched Ideas in August last year, this is a colleague platform, so it's available on our intranet. And we basically promoted out to our colleagues that we want to hear your ideas. If you don't feel listened to, we're here to listen. So basically a colleague would fill in a form, say what their idea was, why they thought it was a good idea, and just give us a bit of information in regards to why they, you know, why they think it'd be a good idea for it to be implemented across Bromford or why it should be changed. So from August up until around, I think it was about April this year, we had 84 ideas submitted from colleagues. And if you flick on to the next slide. So out of those 84 ideas, we took 70 ideas forward that were actionable. So when we say actionable, what we mean is, you know, we shouldn't dismiss it. There's something we could start working on immediately, like how do we get, you know, that valuable data? How can we move forward with this as quickly as possible? Like how could we start doing something tomorrow, next week, or as soon as we could? 14 ideas were refused. So by when we say refused, it's, you know, we are a business, we are an organisation, we do have a strategy, and if it doesn't meet that, or it might not be needed any longer, or the costs outweigh the benefits, then we did decide to dismiss it. But one thing we were conscious of with these colleagues is we always wanted to give them a reason why. We never kind of wanted to fob them off, in a sense. We didn't just want to say no. So we'd always go back to these colleagues and just say, the reason this isn't happening is because X, Y, Z, and just basically always keeping them in the loop. If you go into the next slide. What we wanted to do as well with ideas is we wanted to make it visible. So, you know, we're quite open in the fact that we talk about it's a safe place to fail if things don't work, but this is actually open to the public to view as well. I'll be completely honest, it's probably not as up to date as it should be at the moment, while we're having a bit of a shuffle around with a few ideas, but this is available to colleagues internally and externally. It's available for all public viewing. This lists some of the kind of things that we've been getting through. We have a lot of kind of ideas, which we think is quite heartwarming, quite nice, that it's not just about colleagues, they're actually trying to put ideas through about customers. So, and how we can improve customers' lives, how we can save money, how we can direct them into health services that are like really beneficial to them, how we can improve fitness and well-being. And, you know, there's just so much that's put out there. We recently had something implemented from a colleague, which has now become an official thing in the business, where she absolutely loves to share kind of mindfulness and well-being and, you know, things to calm you down and nice stories. And she's even started a walking group, and this kind of came through ideas. She felt a bit nervous to ask if she could put this out into the business. She didn't think we'd listen. And the fact is we helped implement that for her. We gave her the tools that she needed. And now she's got a monthly mindfulness magazine that goes out across the company, and it's really boosted morale. And like I say, she's just started a walking group, which is great as well. And colleagues are really getting involved in that. And yeah, so I mean, there's to be honest, I'm happy to take lots of questions. It's really hard to kind of put into kind of 10 minutes what we do, but I'm happy to kind of point people in a direction. You can check us out on Bromford Lab as well, bromfordlab.com, where you can see our blogs. We also have started a podcast which talks about ideas and how we're helping colleagues kind of implement those within the business. I spoke about it in our little groups as well. You know, there's not to say that we don't get blockers when it comes to trying to implement these ideas. We definitely get pushback from leaders, but that's what we're here for. We're here to break down the blockers and to see how we can help improve, you know, all our colleagues and customers' lives. So I'll end with one of our favourite slides is don't fall in love with solutions, fall in love with the problems.
Great, thanks, Amy. Oh, keep doing that. Thanks, Amy. Katie, you should have started calling you Amy. I've got Amy there and Katie there, so I started. Sorry. Right, okay. We'll take a few questions in a minute, actually, but I'll probably move on to the bit about kind of strategic innovation and moving forward. I've popped a link to the lab website. The Bromford website is just normally Bromford in the chat. I was told the other day that putting www. is the sign of being an old person, by the way, because everybody knows now if it's got .com on the end how to search on the internet. So I'm officially an old person. Right. Okay. So Katie's approach was very much about developing kind of bottom-up ideas. What we've kind of learned over the past few years, or I have since I've been working in kind of innovation, is that it's not just about having bottom-up ideas, it's having ideas that meet in the middle, that come from kind of middle managers. And it's also about that executive view of the world as well. So what we talk about at Bromford is having an overall view of innovation. And that's why we have a kind of function, a small function that kind of looks at that. Right, can we go on to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm just going to move this to one of the slides. I've got the chat in the way of the slide. I am being a complete old person today. Right, okay, so what happens in organisations, and this is stuff that I've studied for probably the past kind of 9 years, really, is that the concept of organisational silos was coined by a guy called Phil Enser, who said, you know, that silos exist within organisations, whether it's a hospital or whether it's a health trust, whether it's a housing association, for a reason. They're very efficient, essentially. Silos are really good for having a clear business objective and getting things done without interference. So although people talk about dismantling silos. If we dismantle silos in our organizations, it would be terrible, because there'd be loads of stuff that didn't get done because too many people were involved. What we've kind of learned from a collaboration point of view is picking up Katie's point, and then he said Amy again, Katie's point about those more complex ideas are not best managed in a silo. They're best managed cross-organizationally, essentially. So as the moment something gets a little bit more complex, it's usually never in the remit of an individual team. It crosses over into someone else's boundaries. And that's where you need to have a proper approach for exploring those things. And that's one of the things we've kind of learned, is to make distinct, simple ideas that you can crack on and do something with, and more complex ideas that you cannot manage within a silo, because you're going to take a very kind of narrow view of the problem, essentially. Next slide, please. And because of that, I think that, you know, this is a personal view, by the way. It's not something, you know, you can certainly argue against it. I think we talk about collaboration a lot in organizations as if we all understand how to collaborate. And my contention is that actually collaboration is like coaching. It's something that needs to be kind of taught, essentially. And it's something that you need to be very careful with, because collaboration can mean getting a bunch of people in the room and then the most senior person just gets to say what they think and everybody else goes along with it. True collaboration is really, really difficult, actually. And it's really hard to kind of get that diverse voices, different viewpoints, because innovation thrives through different viewpoints, not through consensus, essentially. And what we've kind of learned is that how do you as an organization need to develop an approach that actually does bring in those diverse voices? And certainly when we were coming up with the concept of neighborhood coaching, there was completely different voices within the organization, opposition to the point. There's still opposition to that, but we welcome that in some sense, in the sense that if we don't have that kind of diverse debate, then we won't push things forward. So we've done a lot of work around, you know, particularly amongst leadership, about what it means to collaborate and what it means to actually hear different voices that are counter to your own. Next slide, please. And you know, I think this quote from Joe McGovern, I won't repeat it because you can read it, but I think it's a really good one, in the sense that it's hardly ever taught, actually, you know. And if you think about, I think education's got a lot better, to be fair, over the past few years. But certainly when I was in education, learning was largely a solitary activity, or if you were taught in a classroom, you were evaluated based on your sole performance. So you go and you get your exam results, and then you move forward. When it comes in the workplace, actually, that's not how innovation works. It's a team game, essentially. So how we actually take people through it is really important. And, you know, there wasn't any data on this until about 5 years ago, when there was a kind of worldwide study about kind of collaboration. And what it found was a lot of the Asian countries, Southeast Asian, were better when it came to collaboration than a lot of the kind of the Western economies. And partially that was cultural, but partially it was to do with how they were actually taught differently. And there was some interesting data in that about how girls generally are better at team collaboration than boys. So if you think about kind of who's in management in our organizations and everything, there can sometimes be a kind of a skew towards more autocratic ways of making decisions than collaboration decisions and consensus decisions. So there's a lot to go at within that. And obviously we found as well, because what I do is mainly facilitation as well, is introverts, who are a vital part of the innovation process. They are absolutely as vital as extroverts. They tend to get crowded out in a lot of traditional collaborative activities, and you don't hear from them. And I know from working in innovation sometime, if you don't have the introverts in the room and don't have the introverts making absolute, you're not going to get a decent outcome. You're not going to get an outcome that works without engaging them. So I think there's a lot to go at in terms of how we take innovation forward in our organizations over the next few years. Next slide, please. That's the chart, actually, I just referred to in terms of how girls outperform boys in terms of collaborative activities. It's been developed since, but it's just interesting in terms of actually how those kind of things emerge and then how they play out in the workplace. next slide, please. Before I established the approach at Bromford, I was given a really nice task to go and visit loads of organisations who were kind of seen to be good at innovation, and they weren't all the Apples or the Googles. There were other organisations within the social sector as well. And I didn't see one organisation that did it perfectly. Even the ones who, you know, even when you hear about kind of, you know, Google innovating, they have a load of kind of bureaucracy and they have a load of kind of problems within their organisation. No one's perfect. But I did spot 4 things that I think I'll just mention to you that were consistent traits within the best performing organisations. I've already mentioned it. Friction, actually, that sometimes we as an organisation had shied away from. Actually, effective teams have regular intense debates and are able to bring different viewpoints and their own selves to that debate. High performing people, we've talked about that already anyway. I think this whole point about diversity, and I mean genuine diversity here, in permission to be different, and a culture where it's allowable to push back against management and against other people's ideas. And you know, and this is something we've been talking about at Bromford a lot from a leadership point of view, about everyone should be okay with questioning everybody else's assumptions, even if that assumption is the assumptions of the chief executive. And the point that Katie referred to, the ability to think and act experimentally and to try things out in safe to fail ways and learn things. So essentially be a learning organisation rather than one that kind of shies away from that. What I'll do is I'll just power through and then we'll leave some time for questions. Is that okay? So rather than take questions at this point. So next slide, please. Yeah, so one of the things we've done that I think we need to revisit, if I'm honest, at Bromford, is to build kind of organisational design principles that, but what I referred to in the last session about, you know, one of our principles, the most important one there is at the top, which is build trust. Build trust with colleagues, but build trust with communities. We can't be a coaching organisation if we don't trust our customers to do the right thing. There used to be within this organisation an assumption that if you gave customers any leeway, they would always do the bad thing. They would always do the wrong thing. So building trust is an important principle that we hold across the organisation. And we've got some other ones you can read here as well. Design principles are really important because they don't set out a way of doing things, but they do represent a kind of a vision for the organisation's kind of self-beliefs, what it holds dear, that it believes certain things. So they don't stand in the way about how you do things necessarily, but they do kind of act there as kind of standard bearers of what we should do. So for instance, the joined up Bromford one absolutely reminds us everything we have to do has to be joined up. Although you might be working within a silo, you've got to think about how your work affects the next team or the next person. And that's something that we've kind of, we've been rolling out over a number of years and we're revisiting at the moment. Next one, please. So this is an example of one of our design principles, and it's this comes back to the subject at hand. We've been talking today about services. So one of our principles is that we're not always the right people to solve the problem. We should always think community first, services last. So, and if we do allow a new service or activity, we should be thinking about decommissioning one that doesn't work. We should only do what we do best. And to give you an example of that, and this came through what Katie was talking about with the ideas, one of the biggest things that colleagues keep suggesting is that we should have a handy person service for our customers. So these are kind of jobs that we're not contractually required to do, but it could be helping somebody with things about repairing their home. So it could be older people who can't either access those services or can't do the activities themselves. We've said no to that as an idea because it goes against our strategy of coaching. It goes against the fact that actually we're not the right person to solve that problem. We'll help solve it by connecting people to existing provision in the community. We might even fund a startup business to provide those services, but we are not in the business of providing those kind of services. So that's an example of a design principle acting as a kind of stop doing this, essentially. Someone else could do it better. And our job is not to say the problem doesn't exist. It's more to just recognise we're not the best people to solve that problem. Next slide, please. I always use this example, and some of you will know this, but one of the things I think get in the way, when we talked about earlier about moving, what was notable for me when Amy and Sinead are talking about their jobs, it's kind of almost like, it probably doesn't feel like them to this on occasion, but it sounds quite simple. Start with a conversation. Always remember to start with a conversation. What organisations often do is to put a load of things that get in the way of that original purpose, essentially. And one of my biggest inspirations was the Dutch traffic designer, Hans Monderman, who the slide here illustrates essentially. He had a theory. He was an engineer, and he had a theory that the more traffic signs you put up, the more things that it told most motorists to do and what not to do, the more it confused people, essentially. And his contention, which you can read about in his work, was that the more instruction you gave people, the more it took away personal responsibility. And if you did the opposite, and he tested this out, and I was in Amsterdam for work the other week, and you can just see it to this day, if you take away a lot of these signs and you design spaces or design organizations where there's enough space for people to think about what they're doing and to take more time to think, they don't need the same levels of instruction. And it's a fascinating kind of concept that I think we forget as organizations. Next slide, please. And you can see that across many aspects of Europe, and you can see many aspects of our countries and our towns and our cities now, where there's kind of shared spaces where cyclists, pedestrians, and automobiles can all kind of coexist in one place. What he actually found through his study is actually when you took away some of those kind of instructions, road traffic accidents decreased. They didn't increase because people were much more aware and taking personal responsibility. And I think it's something I kind of always remind ourselves as an organisation. We don't need to keep putting more instruction for colleagues in, for customers in. Sometimes we just need to take things away and allow them a little bit more space to think for themselves. Next slide, please. Actually, I'll skip across this one. I'll go to the next one, please. So when I say this to any organisations who's thinking about this, is to don't think about just one thing, think about what we call the 3 horizons. So things that are actually taking place that you could be working on today, those ideas that Katie talked about that you could work on literally tomorrow. Think about those things that actually do require much more intense collaboration, those kind of sticky issues that aren't going to go away through one team or one person acting alone. And then thinking about what are those things that really the executive should be looking at, those things that are coming down the tracks that haven't even hit your organisation yet. What we often find, and we've had this in my own organisation, so I can talk honestly, is sometimes the executives are too busy looking at operational issues of today, the issues of today, and getting in the way of those things, as opposed to your job, guys, is to look at what's going to be happening tomorrow and what's coming down the track. So I think from a kind of a well-managed kind of approach to innovation, to me, represents those 3 things. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm going to shut up in a second. Things I've learned, about this should have been on Katie's slide really, but essentially, making things work in an organisation. I love the idea. I forgot who came up with it. It was someone in advertising who said the freedom of a tight brief. So actually nail the problem, be really clear about what it is. Innovation thrives when we have constraints. So when people say we haven't got budget to do it, in innovation, that's a good thing, actually, because think about how you can do it almost with no budget, essentially. How could you approach it with the minimum possible resources? That's where innovation comes from. That's where it starts. Second thing is, you don't need to have all your colleagues on board with things. You just need a small group of influential colleagues. And influential, by the way, does not mean in management. Influential means they've got connections. It could be connections with the community. It could be influential community members. It doesn't need to be supported by all the management team. And the other thing I'd say is, one thing I've learned over the past few years, sometimes there's a lot of luck in this and the timing has just got to be right. Bromford Lab have worked on things that have completely failed, that 3 years later, someone else has suggested it and it's come alive for whatever reason. The stars have aligned. I don't know what it is, but actually the timing wasn't right. And there's some things that we keep going in organizations that sometimes, we'd be better just to pull the plug, put them on the shelf. We've literally got a shelf for innovation ideas where we put them, where we'll dust them down for a rainy day. And the final slide, and I will shut up, is that innovation isn't about those ideas. It is about the right solution at the right time, you know, with the right people. Absolutely. And that's one of the things I always try and remember. Phew, I've said my bit. Is there any questions or any kind of points on that? Because I haven't been looking at the chat while I've been doing that.
Sorry, Paul, could you just put that previous slide?
Right, any
back
questions
on,
or
please?
points? I mean, obviously, we've got a few minutes left yet, but we're not going to keep you hanging around too long. All our work is openly accessible at bromfordlab.com and bromford.co.uk for the main organisational website as well. We'll have a slide here with our kind of contacts as well, but we're quite open to speaking with people and taking it forward, because obviously I've picked up loads of kind of ideas today from yourselves as well about things. So before we go, has anyone got any questions or any points? Or Carlos, I think you've got your hand up.
Yes, just a query about kind of the type of problems. I'm not time to look at the lab yet.
Carlos, I think you're on mute, or I am. Oh, that's me.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
I got you, Carlos.
Okay, thanks. I've not had time to look at the lab yet, but just thinking about some of the complexity from a systems thinking perspective. You mentioned about complexity earlier. I'm thinking about kind of wicked problems and kind of the big issues. Do you work on those kind of things as well, or kind of easier stuff, or is it a range of problems?
It's a range of things, and it's a really good question, because I think that's one of those things where, you know this. I know you know this, but it's just worth repeating. It's these things are. It's a lot of the things we work with are those wicked problems that, you know, certainly in our sector, they absolutely interrelate with health. They intersect with income inequality, with homelessness, with just, you know, all those big things essentially. I kind of see these things. So you're absolutely right. So what I call the Horizon 3 stuff, the more kind of complex and systemic things, we try to work on from an executive point of view or senior leadership point of view to try and join those things. But what we try and do is to connect the things that are emerging from colleagues that connect with those. So there's a starting point. So what we're often guilty of, I'll give you an example of this actually practically. When we were forming our attitude, our approach to net zero and sustainability, there was sometimes a reluctance from senior leadership for people on the ground to start doing things, essentially, okay? Well, as I say, those things are not separate. They can coexist as long as you manage them. Because if a colleague or a customer tries this and it really works, that informs our response to a complex problem. And what we used to do, if I'm going to be honest with you, is almost compartmentalize those things. That's a complex problem. That's something simple. Whereas my belief is they can comfortably coexist. In fact, they benefit from that, because if you can start that initial learning of just trying a few things out, you know, but we wouldn't have got to where we are with neighbourhood coaching if we'd have just done a grand business plan, say we were going to change, you know, from a housing management system to 220 odd neighbourhood coaches. We wouldn't have got there. So I think, yes, we do that, but I think you can approach complexity in a simple way, if that makes sense, or a sensible way. Deborah, I think you've got your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, Paul, it's only a quick question. Because you were saying about the Bromford Lab, that your customers can view it as well. Have they also got the ability to put ideas on there?
It's a great question. No, at the moment, only because that specific approach has been launched quite recently. We're just talking to our customer groups at the moment about how we kind of roll that out essentially. But that's the kind of the next stage of it. We did used to do that, to be fair. It's funny how these things go in cycles. And we had at one point, we've always gone for a principle of transparency, essentially. So there are some things we don't publish simply because it would kind of, you know, it could scare people sometimes. You know, I think we default to transparency, but recognize there's some things like, even with colleagues, you've only got to publish something and people start thinking there's going to be a restructure or we're getting rid of people's jobs or whatever. So we're sensitive within that, but we default to transparency. But when we did it initially with customers, what was quite interesting, we had an activist customer group on what's now Sinead's patch in Lichfield, and they started their own website, their own version of Bromford Lab, essentially. And they started it as a bit of a Mickey take, really, just to say about, you know, why are organisations wasting their money on all this innovation? But what happened was they started to generate some really good ideas, some actually quite radical ideas that we were able to incorporate. So I'll be honest with you, we've had to argue against some of the corporate machinery on that principle of defaulting to transparency. You know, there's people who say we shouldn't be publishing this sort of stuff, but we've kept on at it, and we still believe that that's a really valuable thing to do, because, you know, it goes back to that trust thing, doesn't it? If you've got any final questions before I hand over to Sue. Okay, I'll
Got another question, sorry.
Sorry.
Just, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Okay, right. Just thinking back to, if you're leading a lab, I'm just wondering about your, because I'm really interested in this approach. I'm just thinking your experience, what, just putting your experience in kind of leading this, because I would have no idea where to start with something like this. So how did you kind of just dive in and kind of get the idea progressed and kind of able to lead it in a structured way organizationally?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than happy to talk to you at another session or anything, if we just keep in contact or whatever, or drop me a message. But summing up, if I had to say something, I'd just say, this is what I say to most organisations we speak to, don't overthink it. We overthought it. We spent about 2 years nearly before we moved into kind of developing a lab. And this is genuinely true, Carlos. I did a short list of things for the executive that we were going to work on. I think we came up with 12 things that the executive kind of sponsored. We've never worked on any of them, not one of them. So it was like completely wasted R&D. It would have been better just saying the lab's going live. It's not perfect. We're going to start working on it and getting some ideas from colleagues and moving on from there. I can talk to you in more detail, but my overriding message is start as simple as possible and don't overthink it. And keep changing as well, because our approach to innovation is constantly having to change all the time, as it should do.
Carlos, I think you've just got yourself a coach.
Quite happy to do that. Quite happy. I'll hand over to Sue now, but can I just thank everyone for being a really attentive audience, and obviously can also massively thank Amy and Sinead and Katie as well. And thanks for being a great audience, and I hope to keep in touch.
Thanks, Paul. I think just from the comments, everybody echoes the thanks for your colleagues. So in summary, I've picked out 5 things that I think colleagues on the call might want to go away, take back to their own teams, reflect on. I think the first is, it's not just a conversation, it's about human connection. And it's about moving beyond the problem and seeing the person and being able to be in communion with that individual. And the second thing is that it's clear that that genuine interest in supporting others to find their own agency has freed up the way in which you are able to work with your customers, and is a lesson, I think, for us. And I have tweeted as we've gone through the morning, that sense of not seeing people as the problem to be fixed, really powerful, really powerful. The third thing that I've made a note of is I really like the idea of design principles, because I know a number of colleagues that work in housing associations that have set up hand-in-hand services. Actually goes back to the principle in the Bible, you know, if I teach a man to fish, he'll be able to feed himself for life. If I give him the fish, it gives him a meal. I think there is something around how holding true to those design principles actually allows you to have more reach and impact in people's lives than just reacting. And I think that's something that we are very challenged with in health. We have a tendency to react. Fourth thing for me was, you know, just a general comment, but there's some been fabulous snippets and sound bites that if you could lift them and shift them into your organisation, they'd create some of those interesting conversations. And maybe that's something that, listening back on the recording, that we all have an opportunity and a potential to think about. And the last thing that I want to just pick out is, I really appreciate the honesty and the genuine story that you've shared. And I think it's really reinforced for me that the power of stories brings alive the opportunities, and it grounds us in why we're all here. I started off by saying we're all public servants, and we are. And I think if we lose sight of the fact we're here to serve and enable, actually we probably shouldn't be carrying on. We're all leaders on this call. We all have opportunities to create difference. And we've all got the opportunity to create that environment that allows people to be their best selves. And what I heard from your colleagues is they're being their best selves. You can't ask anything more than that. And you're allowing your clients and customers to be their best selves. So I just want to say a real genuine thank you for the time. Thank you for putting the work in. Slides were really engaging, you know, not loads of flipping words, which I get fed up with. So there's just something about the whole way it's being delivered has been quite inspirational. And I just want to thank you on behalf of the collaborative. And what a brilliant entry for me into being part of this group. So really want to thank you. And I'm leaving uplifted. And I think so are others. So thank you, Paul. What a great way to start Thursday.
Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting us again.
Thank you.
Keep in touch. Thank you.
And as he's flashing up our next session, I can't actually catch it because it's flashing so fast.
I think Manar's having some connection problems.
There we go.
So that might account for it. If I could just ask, direct everybody to there is a link to an evaluation survey in the chat box. If I could ask you to please fill that out. We always act on the feedback. It's great to hear people's thoughts, ideas and opportunities for us to develop as a masterclass, to develop sessions that are really pertinent for you. But thank you to everybody for your time today. Hope you found it beneficial, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one in September.
And thank you for the support of everybody in the background.
Yes, thank you, everyone.